Hi again and very welcome to the chapter about the blockade. Well, the blockade, a classical topic within chess strategy, I would say, already back in the days of Nimzowitsch, this topic, this idea was studied very thoroughly. Nimzowitsch, what he noticed was that in the typical case when a knight is blocking an enemy pawn, there are mainly three benefits from this situation. One, we're able to prevent advance of that pawn. Two, perhaps behind that pawn there are other opponent's pieces which automatically become obstructed as well. For example, a rook or a bishop which are blocked by that pawn. And number three, the knight itself in a blockading position where it cannot be attacked by the opponent's pawns, it's usually very active. It's usually a very well-placed knight in that case. So these are obvious benefits from a blockade. I would like to show you at this point very quickly a few cases of a blockade in the opening. So let's have a look at the Tarrasch defense, which is the case which very quickly comes to my mind. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight e3, and c5. Yeah, here we have the initial position of the Tarrasch defense. c takes d5, e takes d5. Let's say white plays knight c3, knight c6, and g3. This was the idea of Rubinstein many years ago. They noticed that this was a very good setup against the Tarrasch. Knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, castles. Here there are many ways to play with white, but let's have a look at one of the most typical ones. Here, bishop g5. Very often black takes here on d4, and after knight takes d4, actually we already have a case of a blockade. You can see that the knight on d4 is confidently blocking the pawn on d5, a typical situation with isolated queen's pawn, by the way. Here black often plays h6. The idea is clear. They would like white to take on f6 so that they can fight back against the blockade. So now the blockade on d4 would suddenly be under a threat. So this is a typical idea for the opponent. Try to avoid a blockade, try to destruct that blockade. However, what white very often plays here is bishop e3 instead. Yeah, this bishop cannot be attacked by the knight really, because in that case we will take the pawn. So very often what black plays here in practice is something like rook e8, improving their pieces. White can do the same thing with rook c1, and one possible move here is bishop f8. At this point, very often in practice, what does white play? Knight takes e6, b takes e6, and here you can see that we have these two pawns which would like very much to advance at some point if properly prepared. But what white usually plays here, I'm definitely sure you can figure out what white would play here, right? You got it. This nice move, knight a4, I think it was Rubinstein himself which used to play in this way. And it's clear what white has in mind. They would like to put the piece on c5, it's probably the bishop. And later on, if black takes back, they will take with the knight. We will have a typical blockading knight there. Maybe later on, we could even use the square on d4 for a blockade. And as you can see, it's not easy for black to advance this pawn. So if black plays something like, let's say, bishop d7, maybe we could play here the move bishop c5. If black takes, we take with the knight. We already have a very nice blockading knight. And later on, we could play something like e3 and queen d4 with a fantastic blockade. I think I have seen some games of Rubinstein actually with this kind of position. So that's a typical case of a blockade in the opening. But okay, let's see a different case. You can see that sometimes we could even give up material in order to arrange a blockade. I wanted to show you this example from the Benoni. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, c5. Let's say black plays here with delayed e6. Let's say black plays with d6, knight c3, g6, e4, bishop g7. Many ways for white to play here, of course, but let's look at h3, castles, knight f3, and e6. So white often plays bishop d3 here, development, e takes d5. White can take in both ways, but let's say they take here with the e pawn. So e takes d5, white has a space advantage. Black often gives check here on e8 and bishop e3. So if you look at this position and you don't know too much about it, you would probably think that, well, black would maybe play something like bishop h6 or maybe knight e7. However, one very interesting way to play here is rook takes e3. Very surprising the first time you see this, right? F takes e3, black simply gave away the whole exchange. However, they have now noticed that the pawn structure is very favorable for them. They would like to install a blockading piece on e5, and as you can see, there is no white bishop on the dark squares anymore. So it makes a lot of sense from a positional point of view. In fact, here white doesn't even bother to protect this pawn. They usually castle here. Black doesn't want to take because in that case later on white can perhaps attack the queen. So usually black plays something like, let's say, knight d7 here, bringing the knight to the game. Let's say white plays queen d2 in order to bring the rook. Very often here knight h5 is played. There is an idea of knight g3, let's say knight e2, and finally knight e5. So you might be surprised if you looked into this that despite being a whole exchange down, actually black has a rather good position here. They can play bishop d7 and later on rook e8. They have a fantastic blockade on e5. It's almost impossible for white to, let's say if they take here, we'll take with the, well, I don't know, with the bishop, with the queen. Let's say with the bishop, it won't be easy for white to dislodge that bishop from e5. So the whole pawn structure will be very favorable for black. Of course, an exchange is an exchange, but maybe here in this case, white's rooks can't become that very active. No, we can play bishop d7. Maybe in the worst case we can even play f6 in order to avoid, let's say, if white doubles the rooks on the f file. So another interesting case of how you can use a blockade already in the opening. I wanted to show you one last case because here we're speaking about blockading with our pieces. So here it's the bishop which is taking up the blockading task, and in this other example with the Taras defense, we saw that it was the knight which was settling on the very nice square on c5. We had this situation, right, with the knight on c5. However, we could also consider the case of having the pawns affecting the blockade. So let's see one last case here. e4, g6. Let's say we play the modern with black pieces, d4, bishop g7. Let's say knight c3, d6, bishop e3, a6. Like my famous compatriot Tigger Hila Passon, he wrote a book about this system. Very interesting to play with black. Let's say white plays here queen d2, b5. Let's play f3 perhaps. The knight comes to d7. Let's say white castles, bishop e7. And already at this point, what white could consider here is to play, let's say, g4. Try to attack on the king side because black's king is perhaps going that way. In any case, white would like to attack somehow. Black would like to play c5, so perhaps they would play rook c8, preparing to go c5 next turn. And white plays h4. So if you look at this situation, you will soon find out that white would very much like to play h5, try to open up the position. We could, of course, play h5 ourselves, but most probably what white would do here, they would take on h5 and then try to attack this rook somehow. Let's say knight e2 going to f4 or maybe to g3 and then push h5. They will have some attacking chances on the king side, that's for sure. So what do you think black should play here instead? After the move h4, which would you think is the most appropriate reply for black? How can they prevent white from opening up the king side? That's right. I'm pretty sure that this is a good move here, h6, and I have seen it being played many times in this kind of situation. So the idea is clear. If white plays here g5, we will of course close everything. By playing h5, it will be much more difficult for white now to open up the position. If they play something like f4, maybe this pawn will become weak, we can play b4 and so on. On the other hand, as you have already guessed by now, if white plays h5, we wouldn't think for more than a millisecond before we play here g5, in order to keep things as close as possible. So this is a typical kind of blockade with the pawns, which is also important to know about in practice. Anyway, we should now have a look at our examples. We have chosen 3 examples to look at. The first one is about a typical case of a successful blockade. The second one is about how we can fight against the blockade by even sacrifices in order to unblock the blockade, destroy the blockade. And our third case, it's related to what you can see here. It's about the blockade with the pawns, using our pawns in order to limit the opponent's actions. So let's move on to our first example. This is an old game. With the white pieces, we have former world champion Ewe, and playing back is Pilnik. Okay, very interesting clash between 2 strong grandmasters at that time. Here it's black to play, and as you can see already, the pawn structure gives us a hint about what black should do here in this typical Grunfeld-Fianchetto structure. As you can see, white has a passed pawn on d5. That's great news for white. Maybe you remember I showed my game against Berrocal, where I was able to neutralize their bishop pair by taking on c5, and then we talked about that black would very much like to bring a knight to d6. This was in the chapter about the bishop pair, but white was able to play bishop e5 and later on swap that knight on e8. So we talked about this idea of bringing a knight to d6, which is a typical idea in this structure, and here Pilnik uses this idea in a slightly different way. I'm sure you can see black's next move here, right? Sorry, you're completely right, of course, knight c4. In this way, the knight is heading for the very nice blockading square on d6. What white played here was b3. I think this was not one of the best games in the career of Max Ewe, but the game became very instructive, that's clear. Perhaps a better idea would have been to play knight b5 instead in order to fight against the blockade. If black plays knight e6 anyway, well, in that case, the blockade would be taken up by the queen, and in that case, maybe white has some chance of later on dislodging the queen, because simply the queen is worth more, so it's more difficult to have it in a blockading task because it can be attacked by the opponent's minor pieces and so on. So maybe knight b5 was better here, but okay, in the game b3 was played. Knight e6, first blockade in this game. There will be more blockades, I should tell you that already now. White played bishop e3. b6 is a good move, overprotecting the pawn so that the knight can move somewhere else. Queen d2. And if you remember, we talked about the mysterious rook move. We had a game of Sousa Polgar where Polgar played a move rook a1 in a position where nothing was really going on the d file. Here we have a similar case. Pilnik plays the very good move rook e8. This move can only be understood if we are looking at the opponent's ideas. It's clear that in this close structure, White would very much like to play f4, attacking the pawn chain, Black's pawn chain. We had such a case, by the way, in the chapter about pawn chains. I think it was one of my games where I was able to break up the position by playing this move f4 myself. So rook e8 makes a lot of sense. Whenever White plays f4, our rook will be very well placed on the e file. Here White played f4. This is a good idea, because if Black takes, well, as you can guess, White should take here with a pawn. In this way, we avoid a blockade on e5, and we're ready to go e5 at some point. So Black should definitely avoid this. In the game, Pilnik plays knight c7. Very clever move, because we need to bring that knight a bit closer to the action, and also sometimes the bishop can use this diagonal, bishop a6. And here I think that Ewe had a bad moment, because it was natural to play something like rook ae1, bringing the last piece to the party, and he should even consider here to expand with f5. If that is the case, it would be more difficult for Black to achieve a blockade in the center. However, in the game, instead, Ewe played the move rook f2. I mean, the move is very logical itself. He would like to double the rooks on the f file. However, there is a tactical flaw. If you look very carefully, you can see that this diagonal is now in Black's interest. There might be tactical motives on this diagonal, and that's exactly what happened. Pilnik didn't miss the opportunity to take on f4. The idea is that now the positionally desirable move g takes f4 in order to go e5 later on would fail to the tactical blow knight takes e4. Very nice intertwining of tactics and strategy. If bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, knight takes e4, well, Black would take on a1 and White wouldn't have any real compensation here for the minus pawn. Well, actually their pawn structure is very bad now. So in the game, Ewe had to take with the bishop instead, and of course that's not what he wanted in the first place, because now we can see that we have one blockade here, and we're soon going to have a blockade on e5 as well. So we will be actually blocking two white pawns at the same time. Bishop a6, activating the bishop in the best possible way. After rook e1, queen e7, as you can see, Black is about to play bishop e5 at any moment. There's no way White can really prevent it. This knight is misplayed. It would have been better replaced on f3 or d3 perhaps. Here Ewe played g4, perhaps not the best move, but okay, already the position is probably slightly advantageous for Black. And I'm pretty sure you can guess Black's next move, right? On the topic of the blockade, which blockading square would you use here, and with which piece? That's right. We can use also our bishops for that purpose. I mean, the typical blocking piece is the knight. We talked about that. It makes a lot of sense because it's not affected by a situation where there is a pawn close to it, since it can jump. But even so, the bishop is also very good with this task. So bishop e5 was played in the game. Bishop takes e5 and queen takes e5. When you're playing with White in this kind of situation, when you're playing with the white pieces, you have to look into how can you actually challenge the exchange, the blockade here. How can you challenge the opponent's blockade? And in this case, you should try to attack this square on e5. How can that square be attacked? Well, it must be by the knight, as you can see here. So which will be the right route to attack the e5 square? As you can see, this bishop is covering this diagonal. So what White should do is try to bring a knight to f3 instead. How can we bring a knight to f3? Well, I guess there is only one way, right? You're completely right. King h1 was a better choice here, trying to play knight e1 and knight f3. I think this game was analyzed by Vtachnik, and Vtachnik, what he noticed here was that if king h1, Black would actually take on e2. So this is a very clever move. We swap that knight before it moves away to f3. And in this way, after rook takes e2, rook f takes e2, actually here White is still a long way from improving. It won't be that easy to bring the remaining knight to f3, because also White must take care of the pawn on e4. So here, after, let's say, rook e7 and bringing the rook to e8, Black would still be better here. As you can see, also the bishop on g2 is really weak. And here maybe this is a good moment to go back to what Nimzowitsch said, that when you're blocking an opponent's pawn, you're not only restricting that pawn, you're also restricting their fellow pieces. We're restricting the bishop, we're restricting both of White's rooks. Actually, in this case, even the knight is restricted, all because White cannot move these pieces. This would be fantastic for White to be able to play e5. You could perhaps even play it in gambit style in order to activate your pieces, but that just won't happen. Also notice that the queen is a good blockader here, because White doesn't have, for example, a dark square bishop, which might be able to attack the queen. So everything depends on which pieces are on the board. Knight g3 was played in the game. Here black played rook e7 in order to bring all the pieces to the party. Bishop f1, and here if we speak about key exchanges, we can look at the pawn structure and we can conclude that probably black's bishop is more useful in this structure with pawns of white color, I mean on white squares. So bishop c8 is a very good idea here, targeting the pawn on g4, bishop e2, bishop d7, rook ef1. And it's funny that it seems to me that Pilnik was so happy about his blockade that he only focused on that part of the board, on his blockading idea in the center. But it was actually possible here to use the fact that we have a pawn majority on the queen side to play in Benoni style, just to push the pawn b5. Well, he didn't do that until much later, but I think it was possible already here. Anyway, rook f8 is not bad either. It's hard for white to progress here, really. Queen c8, sorry, queen c1 and knight ce8. So what's going on with this knight? Well, ultimately, black perhaps would like to bring the knight. Well, in this case, they want to bring the knight to the defense simply, but one day they would like to bring this knight to a blockading post as well. So it makes sense to mobilize this knight for later action. King h1 and f6. Here in this case, what black might be about to do is to use the f7 square for the knight, bring the other knight to d6, put the queen somewhere, and finally bring the last knight to e5. So we will have a double knight blockade. That would just be fantastic. Nimzowitsch would be very happy about that position, I think. Anyway, rook g1 was played in the game, knight g7, and bishop f3. Yeah, that's an ugly bishop, but okay, there is no other bishop left here, really. Queen g5, nice move, because here, as you can see, if black is able to swap queens, we talked about this in the chapter about realizing a positional advantage. When you have a favorable structure, you're very happy to swap queens. So it makes a lot of sense to do this. White played queen takes g5. Well, they didn't really want to play that. They didn't want to swap queens, taking into account their statical inferiority here. But okay, it was not so easy to see what else to do with the queen. Black has great control of the whole board, you could say. Queen takes d5, f takes d5. Interestingly, here we have good doubled pawn, so to speak. As you can see, these pawns are useful here in order to control important squares in the opponent's camp. You cannot really attack them in any way with the white pieces, so it's a good idea for black. Of course, they have to make sure that e5 will not be possible for white, but okay, no real way of white achieving that. As you can see, also the white knights, as before, are very far away from the e5 square. Rook gf1, black played here a nice move, knight ge8. The point is more or less that they would like to put the other knight on e5. But for that to be possible, probably they should first put this knight on f7, then the other knight on d6, and finally that knight should go to e5. Else it's difficult to bring both the knights to the nice blockading positions in the center. So nice thinking here by Pilnik. Knight ge8. Bishop e2, rook takes f2, rook takes f2, king g7, h3. Very difficult to suggest anything for white here. They're just relying on useful moves here, protecting the pawn on g4. Knight f6. Bishop f3. Yeah, that's a very sad bishop in this game, I must say. And bishop e8. Nice move. Here we're speaking about the blockade. It seems that finally it's this knight which will go to e5. And there is really nothing white can do about stopping that from happening. Rook e2. Some last hope of black blundering the move e5, the threat of e5. But of course, that won't happen here. Knight e7. Poor white. Nothing to do here, right? Rook e2. Knight e5. Bishop e2. And finally, black is ready for the move which they could have played a long time ago, but okay, they were not in a hurry, and now finally, here we go, b5. Later on, black went on to win this game using their mobile pawn majority on the queen side, while white was, of course, not able to do the same thing. As you can see here, we have an example of a perfect blockade. That's just a dream position which black reached here, obtained here in the game. The knights are very, very well placed. Nimzowitsch would have enjoyed this position very much. It's not easy at all for white to create any kind of counterplay, and also they're sitting with typical bad bishops. So very nice example here, very nice play by Pilnik in this game. Let's go back very quickly to the beginning. What we have seen here, important idea for black. Once we have this pawn structure on the board, the d5 pawn is a passed pawn. We should try to block it somehow, and that's why we should play here the move knight c4. The knight is the best blocker usually. If we use the queen instead, well, at some moment knight b5 might be annoying, so it's better to use a piece of less value here, like the knight c4. And white played b3. We talked about that sometimes the best method against the opponent's blockade is to try to swap those blockading pieces. So it would have been interesting to play here knight b5 in order to swap the knight when it goes to d6, take it, and maybe bring in the next knight so that in the end perhaps black would be forced to put their queen instead on d6. But in the game, Eowe played b3, and after knight e6, we had this very nice blockade, a typical pattern in openings like the King's Indian, Lebanoni, and so on. Bishop e3, b6, queen d2, rook e8. What we could see here was also that white tried to open up the position. They tried to play, they played f4. They were hoping for black to take so that they could take with the pawn and later on destroy the opponent's blockade again. But black didn't play in that way. They were not that cooperative. Knight c7 was much stronger. And here we have the positional blunder by Eowe. He should have played something like rook ae1, bringing the pieces to the party, but here rook f2 was a very bad mistake from a purely tactical point of view, you could say, because Eowe simply forgot that he couldn't take with the pawn anymore due to the move knight takes e4. So he had to take with the bishop instead, with some piece instead, and here later on Pilnik was able to play bishop e5 with a very nice blockade on the dark squares. All right, now let's have a look at the other side of the coin, so to speak. Let's see a game here with the white pieces, Mikhail Tal, and playing black, Svetozar Gligoric. Here we have a very, very interesting position. Please have a close look at what this is about. As you can see, black has sacrificed the exchange. On the other hand, they have a very favorable pawn structure. You can see that on the queen side, we have a pawn majority. This might turn into a passed pawn later on if black is fortunate. And on the other hand, in the center, we can see that also there, black is fine. The pawn on e4 is weak. It cannot be protected by fellow pawns. We have a very nice blockade already on c5 with this knight, and the other knight is dreaming about taking up the same task, play knight e5 and get a firm grip of the e5 square. Actually, this looks a bit similar to the Benoni case that I was showing at the beginning. Black is exchanged down, but they have very nice dark square control, good pawn structure, and white is missing their dark square bishop, which is the piece which would help in order to fight against black's blockading ideas. So, if we look closer at white's position, we can also see that the pawn on e4, it's actually obstructing several of their pieces, especially the bishop on c2 is a typically bad bishop, and the rook on e1 isn't happy either. It's blocked by this pawn on e4. So, taking all this into account, what do you think that Mikhail Tal played at this moment? You're completely right. He's the exchange up. So, anytime that you're leading in material, it makes sense to make yourself the question, maybe I should give back some of the material in order to obtain some other advantage. Maybe you remember when we saw that game, Elputian's game, in the chapter about weak squares, I think. Elputian sacked exchange, and later on there was a moment where the opponent, if Elputian hadn't played in the right way, the opponent could sack back in order to get control again. And this is something similar. Sometimes when you're material up, you should be ready to give back some. Okay, having said that, the rest is very easy to understand. Of course, you got it completely right, e5. Very nice move. In this way, Mikhail Tal unblocks this idea of putting a knight on e5. He's unblocking the position for his pieces. Now he's losing a pawn, but his pieces will become very happy at this point. Okay, knight takes e5 was played by Gligoric. Of course, they don't want to take with the pawn. In that case, no chance of a blockade, and also you can see that the white pawn would be able to advance. But another interesting idea for black here, actually, which Gligoric mentions in his book, great book, Play Against the Pieces, a book I can really recommend to anybody who would like to learn a little more about chess. Rook takes e5 is what Gligoric looked at in his book. And after knight takes e5, you can see that now black is actually 2 exchanges down. But what a fantastic blockade he has on the dark squares. So how to evaluate this position? Well, Gligoric himself is saying that probably by playing here knight f5, later on try to bring more pieces to the attack, bring a rook to the third rank in some way. Still, white would be better here. They would have an advantage. And I think it's important to understand that once you're 2 exchanges up, most probably you will give back at least one of them at some moment, right? I mean, a move like rook takes e5 followed by d6, there might be ideas like that. You should definitely be ready at this point to give back some of the material, because that's one of the ideas. If you have a close position like this and your rooks really don't feel well, maybe you should use them for that instead, to eliminating some of the opponent's important minor pieces. Okay, in the game instead, there followed knight takes e5, and here Tal played queen f4, bringing the queen a little closer to the action and putting more pressure on the e5 square. Rook e7 was played by Gligoric, and after knight e4, as you can see, white is creating new ideas here. In this position, we have one idea, maybe we can go to b5, maybe we can go to f5, and also there are ideas like knight h5. White is now very happy. As you can see, without the e-pawn on the board, also our bishop has become a good attacking piece. We can use it in the forthcoming attack against the black king. So maybe for that reason here, Gligoric played the move knight e3. In this way, he's able to swap that bishop, but of course, this doesn't help his blockade at all. Now he's left with one less piece for his blockading idea. Just for the record here, if black had taken the pawn on c4, white would have a very nice queen sacrifice. Are you able to see white's queen sacrifice here? You're completely right. Queen takes f7, you can bet that Mikhail Tal wouldn't miss that, right? Queen takes f7, and after rook takes f7, we have rook e8 with mate. So, back to the game. Knight e4, knight e d3. Bishop takes d3, knight takes d3. Now, white should, of course, take first on e7, and after queen takes e7, I think we have an interesting moment in this game, because we're speaking about Mikhail Tal opening up the position, giving away pawn in order to attack and so on. And sometimes I hear people commenting that, oh, Mikhail Tal, that was just about attacks, about sacrifices, and so on. But in my opinion, Tal was a very complete player, a very universal player. He knew everything about chess. He knew how to attack, but also how to defend. He knew about endgames, he knew about strategy, about openings, a complete player. So at this moment, it's interesting the decision that Tal makes at this point. You should see here that white is still slightly ahead in material, but also you should ask yourself which is black's main weaknesses here. Where is white's play? And what Tal notices is that actually, now that there is no black rook on the board anymore, I mean, black is exchanged down. He would have liked to keep one remaining rook here on f8, for example. White could have a rook on b1, let's say. That would have favored black, but now there is no rook left, and that means that actually in the endgame, black will suffer a little more. And having said that, you can guess Tal's next move here. Queen e4, it's time to swap queens. Also in this way, tactically speaking, it will be easier for us to attack the pawn on d6, and that in its turn would help us to create a passed pawn later on, the pawn on d5, for example. Knight e5 was played in the game. Gligoric doesn't want to swap queens, but Tal insists. Here, we could speak about dynamic exchanges. Can you spot an interesting dynamic exchange for white here? An exchange which modifies the pawn structure? Of course, that's right, knight c6. Very good move. In this way, white wants to take with the pawn. No issues with double pawns, of course. Here the idea is to create a passed pawn. Activity in the endgame, you could say. Not so easy for black to defend here in the proper way. If they play queen g5, I think it was Tal who said that he would take on d8. Now that bishop was also under attack, by the way. And if black takes the knight on d8, well, it's time for dynamics here. Let's soften up this knight. How can that be done? Of course, using our pawn, c5, very good move. On the other hand, if black takes the knight on g3 instead, Tal had calculated another very simple tactical blow. Aha, that's right, knight takes f7, and if black takes back, well, we have queen e8. Again, the topic of the last rank. As you can see, black would have liked very much to have at least one rook left. And that's a typical pattern when one side is exchanged down. So knight c6, Gligoric had to take, d takes c6. Now we have a very strong passed pawn on the board. If black takes on e4, they will just help white, because in that case, it becomes easier for white to attack that pawn on d6 and later on help the passed pawn, which, by the way, doesn't have that many enemies anymore. That's good for white. Only these two bishops are trying to prevent the pawn from queening. So in the game, after d takes c6, here Gligoric played queen e5 instead, but it doesn't actually change matters too much. Now it's a matter of technique for Tal. Queen takes e5, d takes e5, rook d1, the rook to the open file, bishop c7. White's play is very natural here. Of course, we should use activity, play as active as possible. Knight e4. This knight will go somewhere. We don't know yet. Maybe over here, maybe over there, depending on black's play. But it's clear that the knight will help us in pushing this important passed pawn. King f8 was played in the game. Now knight e6, just right on time before black plays king e7. After bishop takes, yeah, else I guess knight b5 will just come and the pawn will run and so on. So bishop takes, rook takes, but it's already a matter of technique. The only thing that you should really you should really think about here carefully is how to stop these pawns. And as usual, we say that we should try to control the opponent's passed pawn in the back, no attack from behind. So rook d5 makes a lot of sense here. And after c7, you can see we have the concrete threat of rook d8. Black, for that reason, played here b3, and after pawn takes, rook takes e5, king d6. You already know the right move, of course, rook b5, controlling the pawn from behind. After king takes s7, rook takes b3. White later on converted their extra exchange. Please notice that white is very favored by the fact that we have pawns on both flanks. So, fantastic play by Mikhail Tal. Very nice way in which he managed to unblock the opponent's blockade, so to speak. I would say that it's not that frequent in practice, this method. Sometimes it comes up, but it's not always. We're so fortunate to be able to go for this idea, but it's definitely worthy of knowledge to know this idea of giving up the pawn which is about to be blocked, right? The pawn on e4 is about to be blocked by the knight for the rest of the game almost. You would have very passive pieces here on c2 and on e1, so it's time to release those pieces. We play here e5, we simply give away the pawn in order to create more activity for our pieces. That pawn, it doesn't matter that much, especially in this case because we'll already exchange up. So very nice. Let's have a look at another way of constructing a blockade. So far we have been speaking about using our pieces, especially knights, in the blockading task, but there is also a different kind of blockade which is affected by pawns. Here we have a good example. This is a game between Spassky with the white pieces and Tigran Petrosyan with the black pieces. I would say from all the players in all world chess history, if you say the topic blockade and you think of a specific player, well, I would think of Petrosyan. I think he was the strongest master in this field, the biggest expert in the field of blockading. There is a lot of wealth of games where he showed how to use this concept in practice. And here we have one more of those cases. Petrosyan is playing black. As you can see, we have opposite castled kings. That usually means that both sides would very much like to attack. You can see that black already has the g-file ready to attack. By the way, before we go into the game, please notice also that there is a blockading situation in the center. Earlier on in this game, Petrosyan played c4, which looked like a strategical mistake, because why on earth did he give up the square on d4 to the white knight? Well, it turns out that Petrosyan, since he knew that his king was going to be on this side of the board, he didn't want the opponent to be able to open up the position, like b-file, for example. So he tries to keep it closed, and he doesn't really mind that much that white can use this square. So it's a simple matter of prophylaxis, you could say, like avoid opponent's attack. If white plays knight e4 at some moment, also you can see that the pawn on e5 would be a little weak. Anyway, it's time to attack, we would say here. Why not play something like rook dg8, lining up the rooks on the g-file? Well, maybe h3 is coming up, so maybe white should play something like king h1, and let's say black continues here with rook g6 to go rook hg8. Well, what would happen then? I think that most probably what would happen here is that white could start an attack on their flank. So how can they do that? They could either push b5 or a5. Well, one idea would be to play b5 and later on play a5. If black takes, well, white can be able to somehow get back that pawn. Maybe they can put the queen on some square like queen c2 and later on double the rooks and take the pawn on a5. Yeah, a little long this plan. Takes a lot of time. So maybe what white should rather play here is a5. Now, if black wants to keep things closed here, he would have to play b5, and you can bet that Spassky wouldn't think for a second about playing a6, because in this way he's able to weaken the pawn on b5 before black is able to play a6 himself, which would be the ideal structure for black here. So a6 would be played by white. Black should put the bishop somewhere. Maybe if I put the bishop on c6, they can play knight e4. It's a bit annoying. On the other hand, if black plays bishop a8 instead, white could attack this pawn. How can they do that? Well, using the rook, and later on they could use the knight also. So in fact, in this case, it seems that actually black would have to play bishop c6 anyway. And as you can see, white is already progressing a bit in their attack. With a little imagination, you can think of a move like e4 followed by bishop e3, and white is already starting to get some attacking chances on the queen side. Sorry. So, what can we do about this plan? Maybe instead of attacking, we should first think about our opponent's forthcoming ideas. Yeah, that's what happened in the game. Petrosyan said, okay, I will attack, but first I will neutralize the white attack. White very much wants to open up the game here, b5 or a5. How can I prevent that? Well, by using one little pawn in order to keep the queen side closed. Which pawn move are we speaking about here? That's right. The very nice little move, a6. Okay, once you see this move, it's very easy to understand it. What we're doing here is that we're waiting for white to push one of their pawns, like a5, and we will play b5, keeping things close. And likewise, if they play b5 instead, yeah, we will of course play a5. And no way they can enter on this side of the board. Now it's for us to play on the king side. So we have all the action for us. Very, very nice concept. Once you see this move, it's very easy to understand it. But during the game, I think many of us, myself included, we would just rush to attack on the king side instead. So very nice idea by Petrosian. And actually, we looked at something similar to this in the beginning, right? We saw this case of the Yugoslav, the modern defense with d6. I showed you this example on the opposite flank. So it's actually seen in several different openings with both colors, this idea of putting your pawns at this distance from the opponent's pawns and then just wait for them to commit one of the pawns and we will commit the other one. All right, let's see what happened in the game. King h1 was played in the game. Black continues their attack now. Rook dg8, rook g1, and here we have a nice move. Look what he played here, Petrosian. I mean, if I was playing black, I would probably consider to play, let's say, rook g6 and rook hd8 in order to double the rook simply. But Petrosian looked a little further into the position and he found a nice move, rook d4. What a nice place for the rook. As you can see, now black is actually thinking about perhaps giving away the exchange. That was, by the way, another of Petrosian's greatest areas. He was very good with exchange sacrifices. He would know exactly at which moment it would be a good idea to sack the exchange. Perhaps also this was influenced by his opening repertoire. He would play a lot of closed positions where usually the exchange, I mean the rook itself wasn't that useful as sometimes the knights, for example. So he was very well acquainted with this idea. Rook g4, a much more powerful way of doubling the rooks. Queen d2 was played in the game, rook hg8, and after a5, of course, you already know the reply here. Of course, b5, that's it. A perfect blockade with the pawns. White played rook ad1, and here there followed the move bishop f8. Interesting little move. Why is that so important to play bishop f8? You might think that the idea is to play bishop d7. Well, that's possible to attack the pawn, but actually Petrosian has in mind a more dynamic plan here. He would like to play f6, and after e takes f6, play e5. So it's a good thing that the bishop is not on e7 anymore. Nice plan by Petrosian. Here, probably white should have played here Marin. He analyzed this game, Grandmaster Marin from Romania, analyzed this game, and he notices that, for example, queen d4 was a better move here in order to keep a grip on the pawn on e5. However, in the game, Spassky plays knight h2, winning the exchange, but actually he's helping now black a lot at this moment because Petrosian just took the pawn on e5. He doesn't care about the exchange. He's happy to take that pawn because now after knight takes d4, h takes d4. If you look at this position and you simply count the pawns, you will see that black still has their 8 pawns on the board. White only has 6. So you can say that even black is perhaps slightly ahead in material at this point. And definitely in this kind of closed positions where the white rooks are not very active at all, of course this is very favorable for black, this kind of material situation. So hard time for white. What will happen here later on is that black will actually be able to push the remaining pawns here. Very difficult position for Spassky in this case. e4, good try, of course, trying to open up the position. If now I take on e4, I would just blunder the game. Bishop takes e5 with queen d8 coming up. But of course, that's not going to happen in this game. Petrosian would never allow such a cheap tactical trick. He played instead bishop d6. And now, as you can see, both black's bishops are suddenly becoming much more active in the attack against the white king. It's already difficult here to defend this position. Queen e3 was played in the game, knight d7, in order to win the battle for the h2 b8 diagonal. After bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, white played a strange move here. Probably he was already a bit, how can I say, disillusioned about the course of events. Rook d4 was not a good idea. Black just won a tempo here, e5, and after rook d2, we have a nice move here. Aesthetically speaking, very nice move, f5. So what's going on? So many pawns advancing. Well, it turns out that black would like white to take on f5, and then they can play something like knight f6. And now all the pieces are joining the attack. You can see that maybe the knight could come to e4, for example, or maybe g3 might come up. So very difficult for white here. They preferred in the game to take the other pawn instead, and here we have the move knight f6. Let me see here. I was curious about one detail here. If they take on f5 again, let's see here. Oh, so maybe this is not a good idea. Maybe they can play queen c5. What do you think? Interesting. But I think that still even so, I would take and I would play knight e4 and I would take the pawn. Yeah, I think this is a dream endgame anyway. Okay, I'm also touching this pawn. Oh, sorry, I blundered even here. There is a mate coming up. Aha, so no chance they can swap queens here. Yeah, I think no matter what happens here, white is simply doomed. It's very difficult for white to achieve something here. Also, please notice that queen a7 is always a strike in the air. There's nothing for the queen to do there. It's a lone attacking piece. Nothing else can really happen there. So f5, yeah, I think it's really a good choice. So back to the game. E takes d5 and now f4. Okay, the pawns are looming forward. After queen e4, knight f6, queen f5, check, king b8. Hard to suggest anything for white here. I think the pawn on e5 would also like to join the battle here. E4 followed by f3 and so on. Very, very difficult. f3 was played in the game, but that's an ugly move, of course. White's king is not feeling well on h1. Bishop c8, queen b1, sorry, and g3. Yeah, now it's crystal clear here. h3 is going to come up, rook h8. No way the white king can save itself here. So complete nightmare for white after rook e1, h3. Later on, Petrosyan went on to win. And if you look at this last position here, you can see clearly what he achieved, right? He managed to block confidently the queen side, and Spassky was never even close to attacking in this game. Why did that happen? Well, because of this little move, but very, very useful move, a6, in order to set up a blockade on the queen side using their pawns, waiting for white to commit their pawn, and we will commit our pawn. Very, very nice idea. So summing up what we have seen here in this chapter about the blockade, in the first example, we saw how Pilnik very skillfully managed to create a blockade on the dark squares. The most important move here was the move knight c4 to bring the knight to d6, a typical pattern in this structure. And later on, I would say that Ewe helped him because he played f4 at the moment when he couldn't recapture with the pawn. So he actually helped Pilnik to create a second blockade on e5. Maybe I should just put the final position here just to have a look so that we remember what this was about. It's about this, right? It's about reaching this fantastic blockade. That's what happened in this game. In the other game, on contrary, we saw how Mikhail Tal managed to fight against the opponent's blockade by using this very clever idea. I would say two main ideas in the fight against the blockade. One, swap the blockading pieces, attack them or try to swap them. And two, use Tal's idea here, the pawn push. Try to get rid of that pawn which they are about to block, and in that way you activate all your pieces. And yeah, the position will never be the same again. Now, for example, this bishop is happy, and so is the rook. Finally, we saw here Petrosyan using a pawn blockade in order to limit the opponent's play, in this case on the queen side, using this little move, a6. Try to remember, please, this kind of situation with two pawns staring at each other. The one is waiting for the other one to advance. All right, I hope you have enjoyed this chapter. Thanks, and see you soon.